There are currently also talks about integrating people's Aadhaar data with drone cameras so that it becomes easy for the police and the state governments to identify and track people. And that, of course, opens a different Pandora's box altogether. The COVID-19 lockdown has seen a number of police forces, including Telangana Police, Kerala Police, Delhi Police, deploying drones to keep an eye out on potential lockdown violations. They're also being used to spray disinfectants, which, as far as my understanding goes, are not currently allowed under the regulations. On the other hand, drones also present an opportunity, especially in the backdrop of the lockdown, in helping with fulfilling essential services, especially e-commerce delivery. But although that hasn't really happened yet, it appears as if we've been left to deal with the dire consequences of drone usage rather than reap some of the benefits that they present. What we're largely witnessing is that the uses of drones at the hands of the police, which raises questions around state surveillance and also triggers the proportionality argument. In today's discussion, we'll take a look at the regulatory framework that allows for drone uses in India and if that particular framework has been effective so far. Drones can also be potential enablers, like we've discussed, for certain things, especially during a global crisis like the one in which we find ourselves right now. We'll address why that bit hasn't happened, though. We'll also try and answer questions around accountability and transparency, especially with respect to police usage of drones. We can then open it up to the audience who can ask their questions via the Q&A option at the bottom of their screens. For the discussion, I'm joined by Kishore Janalagada, co-founder of Drone Aerospace Systems, which is involved in manufacturing drones, and Shashank Srinivasan, director at Technology for Wildlife, whose work involves around using drones for wildlife conservation and using them in the wild for location intelligence. So Kishore, let me come to you first. Do you think that the current digital sky policy, which governs the uses of drones, is working at all? Because when the policy was being formulated, the DGCA consulted drone manufacturers. Do you think that your comments found a reflection in the policy that came out in August 2018 and was subsequently implemented in December the same year? Also, from what I've been seeing while reporting, is that a lot of police stations especially use drones manufactured by DJI. Are those drones even allowed to fly in India right now?
So, in my best understanding for your last question, no. The answer is no. They're not allowed as per the DGCA regulation that exists right now. And but there is a catch in that. Coming back to your first question, because of the reason that although the rules and regulations have come out in December 2018, as you said, they are not yet implementable. So they're not yet implementable because the backend systems that are required, that the authentication server that is necessary, is still not functional. So as of now, whoever are doing NPNT clearance and everything, even the manufacturers are doing it as a provisional thing by saying that we are following all your guidelines and we will be able to comply when you get the regulation effective. So it is not, it is for future, not for current. And they're allowed to fly based on that. And even in that category, DJI does not qualify. So therefore, no, it's a violation of the regulation as of now, what the police are doing. So and as far as taking feedback from the customers, they had, DGCA did open out for a public interest of, information. They asked, sent out queries, people put out suggestions of what needs to be done. Some suggestions were taken, some suggestions were not taken, especially with regard to certain things like they had this thing about specifically identifying critical areas, zones, which are not safe to allow people to fly. But typical usage would be that they will publish a negative list and we will not be able to fly in those areas. But no, they didn't want that. They didn't want to publish a negative list. So what they expected us to do is that you tell where you want to fly and we will just tell you whether you can fly or not fly at that time. So it was like they didn't want to publish an open negative list. So that was like one thing which was not taken, but I think that is an easier way to operate. So that's just one example of it.
Okay, Kishore, that's a really interesting statement that's happening there, that the regulations are somehow for a future scenario and not for a current scenario. But the DGCA has kind of made it mandatory post December 1st, 2018. Technically, they are active, but so which makes almost all drone flying illegal in the country, as if the drone regulations do not exist or they do not favor any drone flying.
Yeah, so that's like a hanging sword on your head because you cannot comply to the regulation because it is still not in full effect. and at the same time they can catch you for not complying. It's they can, and you still have to comply as per at least getting the certification process and the the clearance is done. So it is going to be a complicated, and I think it's kind of like a risk on the people who are actually flying right now.
In terms of what a manufacturers can hope for or is hoping for, are manufacturers, drone manufacturers facing issues because they're not sure how to manufacture these drones, or is there some understanding from the drone manufacturers that okay, we can make certain categories of drones, for example, say the nano drones at least,
Right.
who are unregulated, which are unregulated.
So there are manufacturers, but the nano drones only cater to the mostly the toy market. So there are people who are interested in the toy market, and there is, some of them are actually even doing it. Those are the nano drones which are sub 250 grams and cannot fly, I think, 50 meters beyond, 15 feet beyond us. So it's just really a toy tool. But when it comes to manufacturer for the industry, so currently the NPNT not being already available to for actual use, the way it is operating is that the people have created their own NPNT servers as test platforms. So they have like a test server where they have built on the specifications published by the DGCA, but it is not the official one. So people are trying to build an NPNT compliant drone based on these test servers, and that is being provided as proof to DGCA, which is all documentary proof right now. And that is basically given, based on that, you are given a provisional certificate. It's a provisional, it's not a final certificate also. So the provisional certificate allows you to allows you to operate, and actually it doesn't allow you to operate, it allows you to make a sale to the government. So if there is a government tender that is there, the government tender needs to says very clearly that you need to have an NPNT certified drone. And these drones which are given the provisional certification complied to those requirements. So therefore, you're at least able to make a sale to the government, to our government bodies. But yet the operational part of it, because you don't have an actual NPNT, is still dependent upon local law enforcing authority.
So it's really interesting that this is all only to ensure that few companies can get government tenders. At the same time, you're seeing that uh, companies like DJI have clearly issued statements that they are not going to manufacture for Indian standards,
Mm-hmm.
which is what DGCA is bringing out. So are there issues of, say, these drones being exported out of India? I don't think manufacturers can scale out that, right? These are very specifically then designed for India use only.
No, actually there are some manufacturers who, as I best understand, are actually exporting it to lesser countries like Papua New Guinea and sometimes even Indonesia, Philippines, and all of them. So yes, mostly the Southeast Asian countries, there are people exporting it to these countries as well, and where NPNT and others don't play a role. And I think a lot of the people are looking at that as a favorable market also.
There is one last question that I want to ask you, which is on what's the authority of that for DGCA to regulate drones in India? We know it's the Director General of Civil Aviation. That's what
Yes.
DGCA is, and it's only relevant for civil aviation. And clearly, airplanes are defined when they fly beyond a certain height, and that's why I guess your classification of drones and the height limits kick in. But at the same time, I think the current rules are only for drones which are in line of sight. That you can only regulate it, fly a drone if it's in line of sight, and you cannot bring out drones which are out of line of sight, say controlled with radio, controlled with some video form of it. But the DGCA is allowing testing for manufacturers to build them. Can you explain a bit more about this?
That's right. So to the later part, there was an expression of interest that was opened about sometime last year for what is known now as BVLOS, that is Beyond Visual Line of Sight. So this is only only for testing. So you need to qualify with a certain set of categories, criteria as well, which includes that you need to have an actual licensed pilot. That I'm telling about a civil aviation pilot, not a drone pilot. So you need a person with a PPL also as part of that team, which for you to apply for a permit to do this BVLOS testing. And you have to give a particular area which is at least 15 kilometers, 15-kilometer radius, for which you need to speak to either a private land ownership or a government body which gives you the permission to use the particular space for this particular testing. And as a consortium, you can apply for this BVLOS license, and then you are given a permit to fly this test platforms, which only in these test areas are you allowed to actually do beyond visual line of sight. Elsewhere, as you said, you have to fly within the within the visual line of sight, which is defined as, I think, 400 meters. As I recall, it is 400 meters is defined as the line of sight. So you cannot actually fly beyond 400 meters, except in these test areas. And in these test areas, those who have applied, I think right now there are about 4 people who have already been permitted. I have to update myself with the numbers. I think there are 4 people who have been permitted as of now, and there are more who are going to get permission. We ourselves also have we are being evaluated for the same permission in South India. So like these kind of things are also happening in the background, where you are expected to fly for a minimum of 100 hours with one among the DGCA authorities, in their presence. Or how that is going to happen, we'll only know when we actually begin it, because as of now, the evaluation is going on, where they're giving permit to people, and this has already been I think a year and a half now, almost. I think last January, February this started, and it's already now March, so it's over a year since this process has begun. And regarding the first part, whether DGCA is the authority is, I don't know from a legal perspective, that is who gave them the authority. However, world over, even if you look at, say, the US as an example, the drone rules and the enforcing authority is being handled by FAA. So which is also their civil aviation authority. So therefore, across the world, you can see that the civil aviation authority is the one being given charge of doing this. How has DGCA got involved in our country is not sure to me from a legal standpoint. However, my best understanding that is that the Ministry of Home Affairs is what has asked them to actually put the framework and everything, and make sure that they govern the entire process. So as of now, I think initially they were not keen on taking up the responsibility, but I'm seeing more and more that now they seem to be more interested in drones. I think they're more interested in the passenger drones that might eventually come up.
Okay, so we're going to move to Shashank. I'm going to come back to you. I want to try to understand the pilot side of it now that you mentioned passenger drones and how do you pilot drones. Okay. Shashank, you've been training, you've been a drone pilot, you've been using them in wildlife conservation for a really long time now, before I think even the regulations have come into force. Can you tell us what was the scenario before the drone regulations came in, and what's the status right now? Like, was there more confusion back then? Is it more clear now? How is a drone pilot regulated? How was your experience being one, or even getting more people trained as such?
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Srinivas. And welcome back, Soumya. Srinivas just asked me a couple of questions about my experience. I'm just going to go over that. Essentially, I'll just give a brief timeline of the regulation, the regulatory history in India regarding drones, right? So in 2014, sometime in, if I remember around October 10th or so, the DGCA issued a notification which essentially banned all drone flying in the country, all right?
Yes.
Now, before 2014, there were there'll be people who have been flying remote aircraft, like aero modeling, since maybe the early 90s, maybe the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken, right? Again, I grew up in Calcutta, and I was part of an aero modeling club when I was in middle school, so that would be around the mid 90s, and there were people flying aircraft of the Calcutta Maidan. So there's a small runway over there, which is doubled as a cricket pitch as well, and people would fly a model aircraft of that runway. And this is again the mid-90s. So sometime around 2010 or 2011, like the drone industry worldwide started picking up. Again, part of this was people started modifying Arduino devices to actually create like stable quadcopter platforms, and that kind of spiraled off into small independent hobbyists and then small businesses around this as well. So around 2010, 2011, drones started like making their presence felt. DJI started manufacturing the Phantom 1, selling it in a big way. 2014, again in October, there were some incidents in India of drone use. I think, if I remember correctly, the main instigator for the drone ban was a pizza delivery service based out of Bombay, which they had a PR stunt where they delivered a pizza using a drone, and essentially that brought the entire house collapsing down on itself. So the metaphorically, not literally. So essentially, what that resulted in the DGCA ban. So between 2014 and 2019, all drone flying for civilian purposes in India was technically illegal. Now I say technically because from a regulatory perspective, the enforcing authority is unclear, the implementing authority is unclear, who has authority to actually give permission to fly drones was unclear, and is still in practice on the ground, very, very vague. So between 2014 and 2019, there were still drones in the country. There was still a drone industry. There was companies like Asteria Aerospace, like Quidditch, started working specifically in like their niches. So, for example, Quidditch, a company we've collaborated with in the past, has been doing some excellent work around the IPL photography. And they've also done many other projects, and they, again, at this point of time, focus on working in the film world and entertainment itself, right? Companies like them, other companies got the permissions they needed to actually operate very publicly and at high-profile events. But again, under the DGCA regulation, this is all technically illegal because the ban was very tersely worded and did not leave any room for exceptions or exemptions of any kind. So in practice, what that meant is, again, we've also been flying drones over 2017, 2018. And in practice, what this has meant is that we're just working with government departments and we're working with authority to actually operate our devices with like permission letters from people like the district collector, people like the chief secretary of a state, joint secretaries in the government of India headquarters in Delhi, right? So different departments, and these secretaries who are, again, IAS officers who have extreme amounts of like administrative power, issue these letters, and after that the entire state machinery just complies and make sure that the work they want gets done, right? One project I was talking to Swami about earlier was in 2017. So one of the first projects we conducted as a company, as Technology for Wildlife, was on behalf of the Uttar Pradesh Forest Department. They had this was again during Akhilesh Yadav's tenure as Chief Minister. So this is like 2017 February. And essentially, they had a man-eating tiger on the loose in Pilibhit district of western Uttar Pradesh, and the villagers had protested, saying they won't go to vote in the upcoming elections until the tiger was captured and taken care of. So for this, we were called in to actually help the forest department to use drones and actually help locate the tiger. So this is the collaboration we did at that time with the Quidditch, who had drone operators and drones available on standby. And the letter of permission we got was directly from the Chief Minister's office, because he'd essentially said, okay, we need drones among other devices and other technology, other techniques to actually find this tiger. And that was the issuing authority. And again, we were actually conducting these flights, which under DGCA law were technically illegal, with like police officers controlling the drone itself. They were looking at the live video feed. So again, like the question of where the illegality comes into place is unclear, because again, India as a federation, it's got state systems. So, in practice on the ground, it can all be very, very grey. And projects like that have continued over the past few years. People have been doing work for mining companies, for infrastructure of various kinds, for electricity departments. And the permission letters come. They're on official letterheads in the government of India. These are government representatives and officials issuing these letters of permission. And none of this has been contested in a court of law. The DGCA cannot not be aware of these operations because they're very public. Like Quidditch flies drones above every stadium. They get permission from the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Defense to actually do the operations. Do these violate the DGCA ban as well? I don't know.
Shashank, I would like
Just
to.
to add to that,
I have. Sure, Kishore, please go ahead.
just to clarify, I mean, because you said in the 2014 letter that bans the drone flying, it very clearly says that it's for all civilian use except for by government bodies. So therefore, if you get a letter from government bodies, it is considered legal. So that was the reason. So you can only do a government job, you cannot do a private job. That's how it was.
Because also, since I've been reporting on drone users, especially by the police and state governments in particular, so what I have essentially found out while reporting is that there almost is never even a written order that the police can produce. So if you go and ask them who authorized your drone flight, who was the authority behind this, there are almost never written orders, which just gives you a feeling that there is sort of no accountability and especially no transparency around the entire process. Also because the police hires a lot of drones and sometimes you don't even know the people that they're hiring things from. So all of that just adds to this, sort of complex infrastructure that is around there. And it results in something you don't even know what's exactly going on there, if the police was even authorized to fly drones. And that is only, the operational part of it. The drones that are flying in the airs are, of course, capturing footage. So that footage is somewhere, of course, stored, processed. What exactly happens to that particular footage, if there are any sort of security safeguards around it, we don't know anything about the process at all. And all of that begins because of the fact that there is almost never a written order and you don't always know where to go and actually talk to and who to talk to. So how do you think that happens?
So I'll just continue with that.
Yeah.
So that essentially this government bodies component is fascinating, right? Because does that mean that because this is the problem with with tersely worded orders. Is it okay for private parties or private operators to own devices and fly them on behalf of the government? Does the government need to be the one who owning and controlling the devices? Is it okay for the private operators to be hired and to do some operations for the government and other operations privately? Because again, in the past 5 years, no operator has been able to sustain itself only on government contracts because the lack of permissions has resulted in less investment into the sector. So people are actually relying on projects to bootstrap themselves all the way through. And this really confuses matters, right? There have been cases, projects I've heard of where people have gone in, again, like you said, there's no written orders at all. When the operators ask for written orders, the government tells them, you're doing it for us, no one's going to question you, and then they're sent into the field with government officers. There are risks to this because, again, it's not like the government is a monolith. Different departments can contest each other's actions. If for example, the forest department wants to fly drones and the department of mining contest that, does one of them call in the police to actually enforce the no-fly zone? So is that the way it actually works in practice? And it's all very risky, especially on the ground. Like there have been cases where there have been misunderstandings, there's been no written orders. So till someone can actually make the couple of phone calls they require to get through to the senior officer who authorize the action itself, they're not arrested necessarily, but they are definitely being held against their will till they can show that what they were doing was legitimate, whatever that means.
I would also like you to respond to that, but just before you do, I would also like you to address the point of who in this situation, for instance, if the police has hired a particular drone operator, and because we don't have a written order, we don't even know who exactly the drone operator is or which company that person is associated to. Who in this particular case carries the liability? For instance, the data that is collected via the drones, if that particular data is used in a way that it was initially not intended for it to be, so who in that case actually takes the burden and the liability if something actually goes wrong? Please also incorporate that particular bit in your answer.
Sure. So the question of who owns the data itself is, in a sense, does it fall under? I think it falls under copyright law, from my understanding, in that if someone is flying the drone, they're operating the drone, then the SD card or whatever memory storage device they have on the drone itself, they own that. They own that, and therefore they own all the footage on that device as well, right? In practice, what happens is that the police ask for the SD card directly. Again, in most cases where you're working with police departments who are tech savvy and aware of what they're doing, then they essentially have the drone operator fly the drone. The live stream of from the drone, if that's what's being collected, is streamed to them itself because they're operating it while with the drone operator next to them. and they take the SD card from the drone operator, transfer the footage over to their computers, wipe the SD card, and then hand it back to the drone operator, right? In which case, at that point of time, the footage is now the property of the police. The police control it. I don't think copyright law really applies over here because, again, the police have the footage, and there might not be a written order which actually shows that the drone operator did the operation. So again, there might not be a paper trail at all, but the fact remains, again, from my perspective, that the drone operators are the ones who've flown the drone and actually collected the footage. So it's also their responsibility to ensure it's not misused in any way. In practice, again, for the most part, what happens is the police control the footage. There have been cases where they've just had the drone operator to take the footage and make a map for them or something later. And then the drone operator also has a copy of the footage, which is where it can become more risky, where a private party has got data belonging to the public, of the public, which they can use for their own, for anything they want to do. So it might be like mapping out grocery stores, might be mapping out how people are moving around. It might be for future facial recognition analysis. Again, it's with them, and the data privacy bill doesn't really cover situations like this.
Kishore, you want to add something to that?
Yes, about the experience with regard to, especially with regard to Andhra, and you were telling about how a private operator can do a job for a government body. How does it work? In fact, this was I think, in my best understanding, the problem that was trying to be addressed by Andhra, because you cannot, even if you're contracted by the government, you're still a private body doing the job. So how do you handle this situation? Is they came up with something called as a wet lease agreement, which is a typical wet lease agreement which happens for aircraft, where your aircraft and the staff are basically handed over to another company, which is in this case a government thing. So you're as good as working for them, under their banner and everything. So that is how they actually worked around this whole process of at least the legal part. The paperwork was a wet lease agreement. So that is how they got the job done with in Andhra state. When they claim to have a DGCA clearance for the entire state of Andhra Pradesh for this thing, but we never got to see the copy of the clearance, so I don't really know how much it was a copy. So that part I'm not really sure about. Then the second part of it, where he talked about the SD cards and the data being transferred and how that has happened. That's quite a difficult thing, because I can tell you that almost more than half the works that were done were not on paper. So they were not like, there was no document to say the permission is granted or anything like that. It was all phone calls or in person, all those kind of things. And sometimes they would be in your presence while you are flying, but other times they would not. They'll just say, go ahead and then do it. So it was a very, very informal way of doing it. So I don't know accountability, how it's going to work in the context in that thing. About transfer of data, when we did all the survey for Amravati, the new capital of Andhra, all the data was asked by us in voice, again and again on a phone call, to be handed over to a particular person who would come and take a hard disk of data from us. And only later did we get to know that whom we were handing out the data to is not a government representative, but another private party who is doing some other analytics and everything. Now, a consequential issue of this whole thing came up when it came to payment, because we had to showcase that we have done the job and we have got all the data over there. Then comes the thing saying that, okay, when you handed over the data, we have taken a signature of the person who is handing over the data and everything. But when it comes to rules, you need to have it stamped by the department official, signed by a particular authorized signatory, all these kind of things, which were not done at the time of the data collection. So that became an issue also. So yeah, so I don't think anything when actually implementation, nothing happens.
And just to add to that, that's fascinating on the ground, because what that means is that there's almost no record of any of these activities, right? Like there's the footage, but there's no record of the government issuing a contract, of a tender being issued, of modes of payment. It's all very unclear, which is quite difficult to understand in the context of if in case someone had to sue for damages for anything which has happened as a result of either the actual flight or the data collected. How do they go about it? Where's the paper? Where's the evidence? Where's the proof to actually take this to a court of law if that's the route someone wants to take? So again, like underpinning context of the work we're currently working on is like where is recourse? Like if something goes wrong, who do you appeal to? If the police have used drones and have harmed you in some way, you can't go to the police and complain about it because what they're doing is technically illegal under the DGCA's eye. So what recourse do you have to actually obtain justice in this context?
Very interesting, because recently I did a story about how the Kerala police had hired private drone operators. So when I talked to one of the IGPs in the North Zone, I think he was in charge of the Kasaragod district. So he told me that they just have these drone operators, and so the footage is essentially stored on the mobile phones of the police officials. And when I asked him, how do you ensure that the drone operators have actually deleted the data from his side, he just said that we just ensure it. I mean, there was nothing concrete to go with. I'm not even sure if they actually make sure that the data is essentially deleted from a drone operator's devices. Anyway, I think, of course, drones sort of present this dystopic view of the future if you start looking at it that way. But of course, it also essentially can act as a potential enabler, especially in times of a global crisis. For instance, the times we are in right now, especially, for instance, drones can potentially help us in delivering a lot of essential services, fulfilling e-commerce deliveries. Do you think post-lockdown, we might see a push towards that happening, sort of drones being more and more utilized in e-commerce deliveries to fulfill more essential services? And do you see the regulations around drone usage subsequently and consequently being relaxed for that particular issue?
Is this to me?
It's to both of you. It's to both of you. Yeah.
So my personal view is that when it comes to e-commerce delivery, that is things like Amazon, Flipkart, I don't see it happening with drones. Not now. I don't see it even in the much in the future as well. I think of those as more like technology demonstrators to actually learn and understand the technology and further the technology for better causes. Because I think there are far too many safety hazards with drones delivery in crowded urban areas. However, I do see the delivery of essential equipment. Like for example, now if you want PPE if I am a manufacturer of PPE equipment for doctors and everything, there's no way for me to transport it in the current lockdown situation. There's very difficult time. So I think like these kind of intercity or interzonal transportation, I see a good future for that. So you will have like how you have hubs, like airport as a hub. Now you will have smaller hubs where you will have these drone carrying essential equipment and delivery of those things. So I think that there is an advantage, but I will still see that only from an emergency operations and critical missions, not from daily supplies, because I think it's far too expensive for daily supplies.
Shashank, you want to weigh in? Yeah.
Sure. So just to clarify, I think that some of the uses for drones during the current lockdown and pandemic are, I could break them down. There are uses which are extremely useful, but there are also ones which are completely gimmicky, and there are ones which are useful but dangerous, right? So, for example, I do think surveillance is definitely useful as a drone use. But it is very dangerous to consider in the given context, where it's being used by the state to enforce the lockdown quarantine. It's been used again after the Delhi riots. It was used to surveil protests as well. So question of whether the people who are protesting, whether the civil rights are being violated has not been answered clearly. Even now, during the current lockdown, where people have been allowed to leave their houses, have been allowed to actually go to grocery stores, they have been allowed to move outside. So it's not a curfew, it's a lockdown, right? But drones and the police force are still treating it like a curfew, so they're trying to send people back home. So it's one thing to make sure people don't gather in groups. It's another to use drones to chase people down roads to try and get images of their faces so that they can then be prosecuted or arrested at a further point of time, even though they haven't violated any law. They've only violated a lockdown in a sense. And again, it's all very, very unclear. So I do think surveillance is a useful use of drones, but also dangerous. However, using drones for spraying antibiotics during a pandemic caused by a virus is nonsensical. Using loudspeakers on drones for crowd control is also nonsensical, because there's no reason you can't mount those loudspeakers on trucks or other ground vehicles. So there are lots of gimmicks being sold to police departments now. And again, there is an attractiveness to it as well, in that drones are a very easy way to, in a sense, project power, right? Because they're highly visible. They can be quite noisy depending on the type of drone you're using. They can actually be used to project a sense of control where there might not actually be that much control on the ground. Where the drone flies over, everyone like, oh, the police is watching, but actually there's some private operator flying the drone while playing PUBG on the side, So there's no real overlap as to, again, so that the drone is up in the air, and that's what's being used to show power. So going forward, like after the lockdown, hopefully there'll be the valuable uses of drones are the ones which are going to be promulgated in a sense, and the ones which are dangerous are going to be weeded out, or at least like there's going to be proper, safeguards kept implemented so that they're not as dangerous as they currently are.
I think from the discussions so far, what you've basically understood is that drones have been exceptional when it comes to state surveillance, when it comes to carrying out state surveillance. But perhaps for the better part, for the thing that they can be used in better ways, perhaps there still is a long way to go from what we've understood so far. So I think with this, it's okay to open the discussion up for the audience. I would again reiterate that the audience can ask questions using the Q&A section at the bottom of their screens. We already have one question from Shashidhar KJ, who asks if it is possible to standardize drone manufacturing similar to the automobile industry, and if it is, how would it exactly look like for the drone industry? And I think Kishore, you would like to answer that. Yeah.
I definitely think it can be standardized. After all, even the automobile industry, in fact, I like to look at the drone industry as in parallel to the how the automobile industry started up. Everything, including the licensing for the pilots, everything should follow the same model as the automobile industry, is my personal opinion. Certain standards have to be set up, and it can be done. Like, for example, what should be the kind of communication as an example, so that for certain things, like if you want state control to take over rogue drones, there should be just like setting up including an ATC, kind of a thing. If you have, there can be this thing in terms of ethical and non-ethical. Yeah, those are always debatable, and I don't know who will be the right person to comment on those part of it. But definitely, it is possible to standardize, and I think it is a good time to even work on those standardized, mechanism, both in terms of where the drones can be flied, what is the kind of safety regulations, safety precautions that you have to take, including simple things like you have for automobiles, that indicator should always be there. If the light is not working, you can be penalized for, all these kind of things can be put up, and I think they really need to be put up. In fact, one of the reasons why I think we are also struggling is because we never had this kind of dedicated thing from the early days, which is the aero modeling days. Drones are like an evolution of the aero modeling days, and even during aero modeling, there were, if you look at much of the Western countries in US and everything, you had dedicated zones where you can do aero modeling, flying, all of those things are, and you have to follow certain rules. You can't step on to beyond a barricade. You cannot go into the field. Inside the field, only the pilot can get into. There are no support persons. These kind of rules were there, and people were used to follow them. But here they were not. People would just fly anywhere that they found the space to fly. Sometimes over their house also, or random dried up lake in Hebal used to be not Hebal. Hoskote used to be our favorite to go and fly drones. So I think starting from there, we missed the gun, and I think now we still have to start and catch up. And actually, it is possible to form the standardization, and I think we should focus on that.
Shashank, do you have a take on it?
No, not on this particular. Not
okay.
on this question.
Okay, so I think when we talk of drones, and pardon me for bringing this up again and again, because this is essentially what my sort of life's work has been for essentially the good part of the last 6 months. The potential of misusing a drone to begin with, just the bad things associated with it that can be made possible. Second thing is when that particular technology is given to a state department or a police station, or even with different police stations, with different police station jurisdictions, you see a different kind of behavior in terms of how people approach these things. So B, things with that particular police station, with that particular police jurisdiction, and see essentially generally how things have really played out so far, in which the police has been completely lackadaisical in maintaining written orders. It seems as if the DGCA has been completely left out of the equation when it was supposed to be the enforcing and the regulatory authority for drones. How the DGCA has practically been silent for the good part of the last 2 years ever since the policy came into force. So how exactly do you think that this entire ecosystem could potentially be made better so that we can actually sort of take out the better part of the drones and leave aside the things that we don't really want them to be doing in the society? So how do you see this entire infrastructure of drones flying in the air and not actually sort of hampering your civil rights? How exactly are we going to approach there? It's to both of you. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll go first, Kishore. That's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, please do.
So essentially, that's a really large question, right? As to what does like a healthy drone ecosystem in the country look like. Some would argue that what's currently at play is healthy, where the state gets to use drones to do whatever they want with them, and everyone else has to apply for permission. And if the state thinks the permission is good enough, then you go with it, right? And that's I don't personally think it's very healthy, right? Because there are again uses of drones which are outside of state control, which might in a sense be very healthy for civil society, which is using drones to regulate state actions, using drones to map out areas which are contested by, for example, mining companies who the state is supporting, right? So these are all uses, like the idea of being able to submit drone footage to a court when contesting something which the state wants, right, is important. Again, the reason for democracy, the reason to have these the pillars of like executive, legislative, and judicial is so that there is a healthy balance between all three. At this point of time, if drones can only be used by the state against civil society and not by civil society to protect its own interests, then that goes against the interests of the country as a whole, right? Because again, then you start becoming authoritarian as opposed to being a liberal democracy. So just give that as an upfront thing of my personal sense on this. I do think that it is possible to deregulate drone use to some extent, to also decentralize drone control. Right now, again, all of it is with the DGCA sitting out of Delhi. What's been happening in the past few weeks because of the pandemic, again, not the lockdown, but the pandemic itself, is that states are having to bypass the DGCA to actually do what they want because they are finding use for drones in some way or the other. Now, again, like I was saying earlier, some of these might be gimmicky uses, but it is still things the states want to use drones for. Sorry,
Shashank, I'll just interject you there. Even before to be honest, because I've reported on this particular issue even before the pandemic began, and we saw with the protests around CAA rising, erupting essentially around the country, and followed that with the Delhi elections. So we did file a bunch of RTIs about drone uses in these very particular instances. And that is when we came to know that was essentially my lead into knowing that the police essentially doesn't own a lot of drones that it flies. And also the fact that it doesn't even fly those drones themselves. So, the liability and the responsibility is basically shifted to someone else. So even before the pandemic actually hit us, we've been seeing instances where the DGCA has been completely sidelined. There have been no orders. There have been no clearances taken. Offices which have been reported onto as in using drones flying in the air, they don't have a written order, and even so they just don't have an order. And even if they do, they don't have the data maintained centrally somewhere.
Right.
So that's essentially
fascinating,
right?
Even
before the pandemic. Yeah,
that's fascinating, right? Because the idea is that again the DGCA's purpose and what the Minister of Civil Aviation, I think the Junior Minister of Civil Aviation, as well as other government officials have said is that they want the drone industry to take off to actually be a large contributor to India's like GDP in the years to come, because it's an industry which is growing, right? But the rules that they currently are ensure that only operators who work for the state or play by this or who are in favor of the state are allowed to actually operate and do what they want to. So for me personally, I would like to see a lot more NGOs using drones. Right now, almost no NGOs I know of in India use drones. There have been amazing uses of drones and of aerial imagery or satellite imagery by NGOs across the world. For example, in Bangladesh, after the protests, the riots, the genocide in Myanmar, all the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, there was lots of drone mapping done to actually make conditions for them on the ground better. There are numerous examples like this worldwide of civil society using drones for good. In India right now, I would say that's impossible for civil society to do, because the regulations mean that if an NGO who again is regulated by the FCRA decides to try to use drones, they have to follow every single rule in the book, even if the rules contradict each other. While if a police department or any other government departments wants to do the same, they can just go and do it, and they don't have any consequences to suffer going forward, right? That needs to change to actually make it a healthy drone ecosystem in the country.
Kishore.
Yeah, so I have very little to say on this, but yes, I can understand that if you see the news reports recently, also the states are in open defiance of DGCA regulations when they are actually saying that simply we cannot follow the rules of DGCA in these conditions because that's too slow. We need immediate response. We need quick response. All of that. So there's no way that we can actually follow the rules in letter, in spirit. I don't know, but in letter we just simply cannot do it. So that's how it is right now. And I see why. In fact, I think that the regulation should have taken care of emergency needs. Which it doesn't. The emergency needs are an essential part. This was the part where I had put down during the regulation framework also trying to say that there are certain aspects we have to cater to during emergency services. We may not be exactly able to follow these, or there might be other reasons where you can't follow these kind of rules also. So where is there's always this trade-off between freedom and misuse. So where is the line to be drawn and how it is to be drawn is very, very blurred.
Okay, Kishore, we have a follow-up on Shashidhar's initial question about standardization of drone manufacturing. So Shashidhar's follow-up is, so when you say that we can standardize communication protocols, do you think that we should dedicate a band of spectrum for drone communication? And if that's possible, what are the possible implications for net neutrality in that particular instance?
So I'm not very familiar with the net neutrality, arguments around it. So I won't be able to say on that. But I don't think there's a necessity to actually do a separate bandwidth for this, because with the way things are moving, we can continue to use the existing protocols and technology which is already in the market for this, which can include things like even your 4G and 5G networks for communication. It could include your Wi-Fi, and it can include your other frequencies, which is in the 2.4 ISM band itself to do this. So there is no real requirement for you to go with separate spectrum. However, if we go beyond this small commercial usage, and if we want to go in consumer usage and go into commercial usage, where we'll have to start synchronizing with air traffic control of the regular aircraft, because we might be interfering with those safety requirements over there. During that time, they have specific spectrums already allocated for air traffic control, and we will have to integrate within those things.
Before this, you were actually discussing about how drones can potentially be used for instance, in healthcare services, essential services, basically,
Yes.
to essentially behave like an enabler. So Mr. Ravi Krishnamurthy here has perhaps an add-on to that. He wants to know about the potential of uses of drones specifically for agricultural purposes, like for spraying pesticides or nutrients, or even crop health analysis, for carrying out crop health analysis. And before this discussion, I remember you saying that agriculture was one of those areas which was, to begin with, sort of relaxed even when drones were being banned for 2014. So how do you essentially see that playing out right now?
So in terms of the regulation and the framework, if I have to say, as per the DGCA regulation, which has come out in 2018 December, it specifically says that payload delivery, and how does it define payload delivery, is nothing should separate from the drone in flight. And that is the definition of payload delivery. So which means that you cannot do spraying at all legally currently. So that is how the regulation is framed right now. However, there is a frequently asked questions that is attached to the regulation, and in that sense, specifically for farmer use for pesticide and crop spraying, it will be allowed. That is in the FAQ and not in the it's in the FAQ and the guidelines, not in the policy document.
Okay.
So that is one thing. So that therefore it's a little questionable, but it is allowed. But there is another governing body which disallows it. Again, this is not to do with DGCA. There is another governing body. I'm not sure about what is the name of the government body. It is basically for It is an agency which controls pesticide spraying and other things, general agricultural general agricultural use, in which it very clearly says that aerial spraying on farms is not allowed, which includes drones now. And the justification that they may have, which I presume, I'm not entirely certain of it, aerial spraying is not allowed in farms because aerial spraying is typically done from a higher altitude, which basically means that when your spraying happens, it will go into areas which is not the target area and which is undesirable, and therefore they have restricted spraying from aerial drones itself. So this is from the regulatory legal perspective. Even if DGCA has allowed drone spraying in their guidelines and the FAQ, it is still restricted by the I think it is what ministry it is, I'm not really sure. It is the Agriculture and Farming Ministry or something like that. I have to check the actual agency that disallows it.
Kishore, what you told is particularly interesting, given that as we were entering sort of the peak of this pandemic spreading in the country, where almost every state started taking this essentially as a pandemic and started treating it essentially as one, is that we saw drones actually being deployed and sort of being used to spray disinfectants around particular areas within the state. So now that you say that the only sort of relaxation was to spray disinfectants when farmers are using them, so how essentially did that, I mean, when drones are being used to spray disinfectants over cities, how does that not violate DGCA's norms in that case, from what you said?
In my understanding, it violates.
Okay.
But who's going to bell the cat?
Okay. Shashank, I have a question for you particularly because you've been involved, you've worked with the UP government's forest department. So I want to understand, so when a particular government body approaches you for a particular project, so what exactly is their scope of work to begin with? And do you see that sort of with time and as the project carries on, do you see that particular scope also widening in its reach? So that's my first part of the question. The second is, what exactly were you supposed to capture? And whatever footage you capture, how did the data sharing happen? How exactly it was ensured that what you captured became the government's property and you did not retain any bit of it? And whatever the government took away from you, how exactly was that data stored, processed? What were the safeguards? I want to understand how that particular process works.
So to reiterate, the project happened, this particular one, it did happen in 2017. It's a very short project, only for about 3 days. The scope of the project didn't widen at all. And again, to clarify, this was not a project under a tender for the government, right? Because tenders take time. So in this case, what the mode of operation was that, like, a large NGO who knew the forest department well got in touch with us and said, hey, by the way, the forest department wants to use drones for this operation and we can cover your cost for it. Will you be willing to do it? And we said, yes, sure, we'll do it. Right. So in a sense, there's no financial transaction between the government body who authorized the operation and wanted the operation and the drone operator in this context. And that's pretty normal from what I can make out, right? Because again, it's hard for the government to do quick short-term projects which are being paid for. So even in the current time, under the current pandemic, it's unclear as to how much of the drone work being done is volunteer drone work by drone operators who are doing it in the interest of getting further work in the future in the government. So it's a way to do free work, so they're validating their operating credentials with, like, the police department so that they can use them for letters of reference going forward. How much of this work is paid? And again, like, I have absolutely no insight into what the funding mechanism is, for example, all the drone surveillance work happening for the pandemic right now across the country. So there have been projects in Delhi, projects in Ahmedabad, in Telangana that I know of, which have definitely been well advertised. But again, who's paying for it, how it's being paid for is unclear at this point of time. Going back to our project specifically, which was, again, before the regulations in the current form were implemented, what the State Department wanted is they wanted drones to be flown to actually find this rogue tiger, right? So they wanted us to, that was the scope of work, which is that fly drones for this many hours a day and looking for a tiger under supervision of the Forest Department official in charge on the ground, right? In that case, at the time it was the PCCF, the Principal Chief Conservator of Forests for the state, because it was such a high-profile project. And the drones were flown. The live stream of the the drone video was being shared with the forest officials on the ground who were there with us. They were using it to actually do command and control. So that is interesting, where they were looking at the footage from above and actually making things happen on the ground in accordance with that, right? So they were telling, okay, send elephants that way because that area needs to be closed off. Put up a fence here because we can see there is a gap where the tiger might run out of. So that was being done using the drone footage. But the other more interesting is, even back then, because this was 3 years ago, was that people weren't really familiar with drones at that point of time. So in one case, we were on one particular day, we were told to fly a drone over an area where they knew that there was no chance of finding a tiger, because they wanted the local population who were streaming out, looking at the operation, to actually come and move away from the actual operation site. So they flew the drone so that people gathered around to actually look at the drone while the elephants and the forest guards conducted the search operation a few kilometers away, right? So it was used as a, in a sense, not as surveillance, but as a distraction to make sure that the work could happen unhindered, right? So again, I don't think it really expanded the scope of work, because we were just going to fly a drone in aid of this tiger capture project, and that's what we actually did. And all the footage we collected, again, it had, people were captured in the footage, but they were incidental captures, because the main focus was the actual operation itself. And all the footage captured was handed over to the forest department, who at that point of time were very explicit about the fact that they didn't want this footage showing up on any TV channel or any media anywhere else at all, right? Again, there was, so for this entire project, okay, there's no written paperwork actually saying go ahead and do the project, right? There's no financial trail linking the government to the drone operators in this context. It's all completely, in a sense, deniable, and this was again a few years ago, but there's no way to actually track back and say, okay, who ordered what at what point of time, because a lot of it, as Kishore mentioned, is verbal, is over the phone, is people who are meeting and then speaking to each other, and again, not for any reasons of secrecy, but just because that's the way things operate on the ground. So things are just being done in that particular manner. The case today is not very different. Even with the regulations in place, things still operate the same way on the ground as well, which we're all familiar with, and that does need to change. Things need to be more formal to actually ensure accountability.
There's been a follow-up question from Mr. Ravi, who asked about the initial question about the use of drones for agricultural purposes. So Mr. Ravi is asking if there is any chance that the no spraying regulation could potentially come under the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizer. Kishore, that's for you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just checking out the details of that. But it is supposedly as per the Insecticide Act.
Okay.
According to the Insecticide Act, you cannot use drones and unmanned machines and hazardous tools for spraying hazardous chemicals. I'm just trying to read through the details as we speak.
Okay.
It is Insecticides Act 1968. Aerial application of pesticides needs approval permission from the Central Insecticides Board. Further, no permission approval has been granted by the Central Insecticide Board in the past for the use of the drones to spray pesticides. So, Central Insecticides Board, that's the governing body there.
Okay, so we have a very interesting question here. It's from an anonymous attendee, but the question is quite interesting. So, of course, biometric data is under the current Personal Data Protection Bill, which is being deliberated upon by a joint parliamentary committee, classifies biometric data under sensitive personal data. And of course, the thing that a drone records, which includes your facial data, your thermal data, potentially all of them fall under biometrics, and as a result under sensitive personal data. So do you think in that particular instance, because it's dealing with something as serious as sensitive personal data, and the data protection bill in its current form also emphasizes a lot of safeguards for this particular category of personal data, do you think in protection?
Is that for me?
It's open to both of you.
Okay, I'm not I don't understand the privacy. I mean, I'm not very familiar with the whole privacy arguments that go around. So therefore, I'm not a very good person to be talking in those lines. However, yes, I do agree that when we have seen this data privacy in the way the operations have been in the past, it's always been a concern even for us also. Because at any time, will this be brought back and labeled on us? As a business, I've been more interested in safeguarding my own business. at the time, so it's like whenever I'm handing over data, because of the problem, we handed over, when we were doing data even for the national highways and other places, they were supposed to be in the original discussion, you have like a secure login, we are supposed to copy our data into those particular places, and those kind of things were there talked about. But when it actually comes to action, or it is like, it's a very casual hard disk, you take one hard disk somewhere, he goes, then I have to call him back and ask him so many times, you have to give me back my hard disk, I need to copy new data, this kind of, and then he'll say, I'll come 1 hour, I have to go to this place, I have to go to, I mean, it's extremely casual. That's what I want to say. It's always been extremely casual in handling of data. But in terms of what kind of concerns we should have, I think a person who is studying privacy should be a better person to, argue about that.
I mean, I would of course say that anyone who's dealing with use of drones, and the police in particular, given the kind of abuse that's possible in their hands, of course, drones should be held to extremely high safety standards and to extremely stringent protocols. Shashank, would you want to answer?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question, and I would definitely answer that. I don't know about higher standards, but all of it should be held to a high standard, right? All biometric data. So even with like drone use, there are practices people can follow on the ground. So one reference is this group called We Robotics, which is based out of Switzerland. It's a large drones for good humanitarian action non-profit, sets up groups of what they call flying labs across the world, which are essentially consortiums of drones for good users in various countries. So in India, for example, we are part of the India Flying Lab, which is one such group. Now, We Robotics is also one of the formulators of the humanitarian unmanned aerial vehicle operator network, so the humanitarian UAV network, which essentially formulates guidelines for the use of UAVs in humanitarian settings. And part of their guidelines include information for drone operators on privacy, which essentially is that if you're capturing footage, try not to do any live streaming work. Like, you can always record footage and then play it back later. So don't do any live streaming work. And also when capturing footage, take it from top down, not at an angle, so that you don't capture people's faces in the footage, because that's almost never required from a humanitarian perspective, right? And those are good guidelines to follow even in regular drone use as we go forward. So I would definitely say people interested more in this, the HUAV network is a good resource, as is We Robotics. And India specifically, what Medianama has been doing is fascinating. So again, those RTIs were really useful after the Delhi protests and the riots, and in terms of how the drones were being used. And also the Internet Freedom Foundation has been doing some work around drones as well in India. So that's another good resource to look into for more information on privacy around drones.
You said interesting about the shooting angles very particularly, because at least with the Kerala story that we did, the police said that they've actually, and this story is from last week, from what I remember, is that the police said that in only that one small district, they had arrested at least 170 people within 3 days itself, people who were violating the lockdown. So which clearly means that it was definitely not just a top-down thing to perhaps scare away people into their homes.
Sure.
But the police was very actively looking for people who were violating it, and they were actually hunting them down after that.
No, there's lots of footage of angled shots where you can see people's faces quite clearly. They're being, again, going back to the issue of abuse at the hands of the police, right? In terms of how drones can be misused. There have been cases, again, I've seen footage from Ahmedabad where drones are being used to film people on their rooftops. So you have no idea whether they're part of one family, but they're all living in one building. Obviously, they're up on the roof enjoying the evening, and then a drone flies overhead and captures footage of all of them, right? And they're on private property. Again, complete violation of the civil rights, and it's absolutely useless in the terms of enforcing a lockdown, because what do you get out of chasing people on private property who are in the same building back indoors when they're out on their roofs? It's not like a virus spreads by line of sight, right? It's biological. It's not this irrational. If you look at someone, you can get a virus, right? But that's the way they're acting. And drones are totally being used to enforce this very perverse notion of what a lockdown should look like.
Kishore, I had a question for you in particular. So this morning I did a story. This was a small instance from a place called Morbi city in Gujarat, where the police. The video went quite well. I'm sure you must be aware of it. Where two entrepreneurial gentlemen were actually using a drone, and on the drone was tied two tobacco packets, and they were essentially distributing it among themselves. So the police arrested both of them on the charges of delivering a non-essential commodity during the lockdown under Section 188, so which wasn't allowed. But when I asked them about why they did not also charge them on using a drone without any kind of a clearance, the police in that police station told me that they did not even know what kind of a drone it was and what they should even start doing about it. So, with all the kind of relaxations and limitations within the digital sky policy, that, for instance, a nano drone can be used for a particular purpose, a micro drone can be used for another particular purpose. So do you think that on the ground, when police people will actually be implementing this thing, there perhaps is not enough knowledge, which again results in, sort of the regulation not being implemented the way it is expected to be?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a lack of information, because I think the police generally tend to look at it from the current situation of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. So if in their own judgment that they think that the cause is justified, then you are let go of whatever your crime. So it is like that way. I think they take that independent discussion that tends to happen in the way it operates right now. But yes, I think it is very difficult to justify a good legitimate good use and differentiate it from a bad use of a drone. So I think that complication is going to be there, not now, it's going to be there even in the future. I think a lot in actual implementation of distinguishing between a good use and a bad use over there. In this particular case that you are telling me, I see there are different cases that can actually be filed. One is yours for distribution of this thing, but definitely I think there is another side of it, which is to say that illegal flying of drone itself is case to book. So I think they can definitely be charged, whether it is in the big picture the right thing to do or not. As per the law, I think they can be charged for illegal flying also. And but then there is also a problem. It's like, for example, the crop spraying drones. When if DGCA has given, whether how legitimate is a guideline or a FAQ be giving you permission to do a crop spraying drone when the regulation does not allow it. So I don't know the legitimacy of that. But even if I take that as the rule and say that okay, you can do a farmer thing, the same drones which were under that category built for farming are today doing disinfectant spraying in the city. It's an illegal use the reason that they were allowed to build that particular drone itself was for certain other cause, and now it is not being used for that purpose. So I think, yeah, there's going to be a lot of questioning that can happen around all of these things. I think it's only because it is enforced by a government agency that it's going to be taken lightly, but otherwise I think as per purely speaking by the rule book, it's illegal in all ways.
Shashank, would you want to weigh into that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Kishore. Like, the thing is, you can easily prosecute people trading tobacco using a drone, but then you should be prosecuting everybody, right? Because the idea is that if you have laws which are so vague as to be selectively applied, then they're unjust, because you cannot just pick and choose when you can apply a law, because that's not the way laws are supposed to work. They don't work one way for some people and a different way for other people. So if you're going to prosecute anyone on illegal flying, everyone who's doing illegal flying, which is everyone flying a civilian drone in India at this point of time, should be prosecuted.
Including the police.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the way it should work.
Okay, I think I have one potentially big question about the silence of the DGCA in how the policy has been sort of implemented, or the lack of the implementation of the policy, and how the DGCA has been absolutely silent. How it has also in many instances been singled out and almost left out, where its acknowledgement has not even been felt necessary. So do you think that perhaps the entire policy in itself needs a relooking, and to begin with, the provisions might potentially be difficult to enforce, and do you think all of that needs restructuring and reworking again, just to ensure that the policy at the ground level is at least implementable, and the DGCA can at least be kept in the know-how of how it's being used on the ground?
My personal opinion is that if you try to make a framework which is going to be covering every aspect of potential use and misuse, it's going to be so exhaustive that nobody's actually going to follow it. I think it should be incremental. You make a rule which is rather very simplistic to begin with, and you keep amending it or improving it based on the actual use case. how people are misusing it over time. So then you bring in a particular extra clause or whatever you need to do to actually curb that particular use. But I think trying to have an overarching entire spectrum covering regulation right from the start is not going to work. And that's exactly how I think even FAA started doing it, because they had initially a fairly simplistic, and they kept uh, amending those rules and regulations based on the actual ground scenario, how people are using and misusing it. Based on that, they would actually keep amending it. If you look at our regulation, there has only been one that has come out, and it's tried to be over in covering the entire, trying at least with the intent to cover the entire spectrum, and it's not been effective at from A to Z for anything, in the end.
Yeah.
So it has not helped in any way that way.
Well, to be fair, there were also talks of a drone policy 2.0 as soon as the first policy itself came out, I think within a month or two. But of course, that hasn't materialized. Shashank, you were saying something.
They did come up with a I think at the aerospace convention, I forgot the stage event that happened in January of 2019 last year. So that is when it was announced that BVLOS 2.0 will be out and the draft is already ready. All of those things came out over there, and then it's silent since then.
Yeah.
Shashank, you were saying something.
So I do think that over here, at least on the ground, what's interesting is that the moment there was a crisis and emergency where the different states felt that they had to do something about it, the policy just went out of the window, right? And again, like you're saying, it's been happening for a while as well, but it's far more visible now in the past few weeks, because the states are now have a very explicit reason, which is that, we need drones really badly, and the regulations are actually in the way, which is a very strong indicator that something needs to change drastically, right? And one way to look at it is the fact that the Ministry of Civil Aviation and the DGCA are responsible for like air safety, among other things. So one way to partition it is to, for example, make the safety part of drones come under the DGCA, and the regulations only apply for safety around drones. So fly drones, for example, telling the nearest like Air Force base or telling other aircraft operators in the area, so there's no like untoward incident in the air itself. But actual operations happen with the consent of the local administration, because we've had again very good experiences working directly with district collectors and district magistrates, because they know what's needed on the ground, they understand their jurisdiction very well, they're able to actually say, okay, fine, this operation is going to help like civil society at large, so we'll permit the operation, right? And again, they have local information on this, and that's definitely one way to actually take things forward, because at this point of time, the current scenario is not working for anyone.
So this is Kishore is saying something. Oh, Srinivas, you want to weigh in something?
So I want to ask one question. So we had a couple of drone instances in the UK, I believe, which resulted in airport lockdowns. I think it was Glasgow Airport, maybe, where
UK.
Yeah, in UK. Gatwick. Okay. Yeah, the Gatwick instance. So where we had someone claiming they spotted a drone, and the entire airport like shuts down. All the flights are halted. Then the cops essentially send in choppers to find this drone. So anybody who sees a chopper thinks it's actually a drone in the night. I think it was the pilots actually who was trying to take off, who reports the air traffic controller that he has seen an unidentified object. He doesn't know if it's a drone. He doesn't know what it is. So now, which brings this question let's bring this question to DGCA. Will the DGCA only wake up when it comes to the safety question of airports and a drone being spotted at an airport? What does it take to actually bring safety into the picture, regulating drones in the right way so that we avoid this? I mean, it could be a hobby thing. It could be actually someone miscreant who's probably doing this. But the concerns do remain, and DGCA actually takes its counter civil aviation authority seriously, because during the consultations, they were actually receiving a lot of inputs from their brother and sister organizations who would tell them what they should be doing. So will the Indian experience matter to others, or will it's a larger policy question that I have.
There was actually a particular, you quoted the UK event that happened, but a similar thing also happened in India, and it was not reported so widely and not so seriously taken. But I think the warning signals went out even during in India itself also. So yes, I think there is a good case for it. In fact, I think that there are this is a this is the reason why anti-drone technology is a area that I think is of very high importance. And it is my understanding that the real drone regulation, which is as of now just a eyewash, is real drone regulation is actually going to take off when they have anti-drone technology. So that will be the key to actually getting a full-fledged effective drone regulation in India. That is my understanding. And anti-drone technology is, as of now, best understood in three formats. One is completely shoot down a drone which you think is illegal. That's one method to do it. Then the second method is wherein you actually take control of the drone and land it down to safety. And the third method is where you completely jam the communication and assume that in the jammed communication it is taken care of. The drone is taken care of. Sort of like that. So effective anti-drone technology is, I think, the key to getting a very good drone policy.
Shashank, do you have a comment on this particular question?
That's fine. Kishore really covered that well.
Okay. So I think it was a pretty fascinating discussion, especially for me, because I've been I've also been very limited in the way that I've been looking at drones, especially with how the police uses it. But of course, there is an entire gamut on how potentially drones can be enablers, but also raise significant privacy and surveillance concerns. So what we're essentially seeing play out in India, is, at least in the last year, is that drones have essentially been a tool of state surveillance. They've helped the police almost every time that they wanted it to. The police has been absolutely whimsical in the way that they've been deploying drones. There's never written order, like I've regurgitated at least n number of times by now, which of course raises questions around accountability and transparency in the entire process. Then there are concerns about what the drone policy in itself can do, if it can in itself be an enabler, if it helps Indian manufacturers, if it helps them in the competition from certain Chinese manufacturers, also from the US, especially for defense and commercial drones. What my sense essentially is from here is that drones will and are becoming tools that we'll perhaps see more and more, especially after the lockdown ends. I do hope that people who use drones do not end up abusing them, and they keep in mind that people roaming around in the streets should not be viewed as essentially criminals, and they have to prove otherwise. Drones should not hamper people's civil liberties. People are people. And so I think it was a pretty great discussion. We talked about the policies and if the policies need reworking and how the DGCA has been silent. So the DGCA perhaps should look at the discussion and potentially wake up to the occasion. So the attendees will see a feedback form at the end of the discussion. I would urge them to use the form and leave their feedback about the discussion. Also mention things that we should consider perhaps for discussions from here. I would also urge all of you to please join friends.hasky.com. That way we can keep updating you about discussions, and we can keep chatting about what we are about to do next. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope to see all of you very soon.
Thank you, Soumya. Thanks, Kishore.
Thank you, Shashank.
Thank you,
Kishore. Thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity.
See you.